In 2020, tensions in America grew rapidly. Over 100,000 people died from the coronavirus. Millions lost their jobs and were stuck because of lockdown measures. Political divisions were at an all-time high, and racism had been a feature that some people thought was eradicated in American history because of Barack Obama, but was still alive beyond the surface. It would take the death of one man to set the country into a frenzy, with race once again at its centerfold. This is the story of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests. To give you some context about why we are here today, let's talk about what happened to George Floyd. George Floyd was a 46-year-old man with 5 children. Originally from Houston, Texas, he'd moved to Minneapolis, Minnesota to find work. Life hadn't been so smooth sailing for him. You see, he had a couple light convictions under his belt and he'd been battling a drug addiction. He was trying to turn his life around. He had been volunteering with Christian charities and he was developing skills so he can gain long-term employment. Everything changed on May the 25th, 2020. The police were called to the Cup Foods grocery store in Minneapolis with a report that a man had been using a fake $20 bill. These are pretty light offences. They can be dealt with pretty easily and quickly with some good resolve. But what happens is that this happens instead. Now, George Floyd refused to give back the cigarettes that he bought from the shop with that money. And when the police arrived, things started to escalate quickly. Officer Thomas Lane pointed his gun at George and ordered him to put his hands up. And he was handcuffed. George is compliant. He's fully compliant with everything that's happening. He's been arrested and he's talking to the police officers and he's trying to get by. But the problem is that then the atmosphere changes significantly when they try and put him in a police car. George Floyd now starts to panic. He becomes a bit more hesitant and he becomes a bit less cooperative to what's happening to him. And this only gets worse when Officer Derek Chauvin arrives at the scene. He applies more pressure on George Floyd and makes it a lot harder for him to stay calm. They don't decide to try and cool the situation down. They just keep on increasing it. Now this is until Chauvin restrains George Floyd by putting his knee on Floyd's neck. And this carries on for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Now, this whole altercation is recorded by a bystander. And you can clearly tell that George is in distress. He's constantly crying out for his mum. And he tells Officer Chauvin over 20 times that he can't breathe. Imagine telling somebody, hey, can you make me a cup of tea? Imagine telling somebody 20 times. Surely they'll make a cup of tea then. But when they've got a knee on your neck, well, you know what? We'll just keep it there. Don't worry about it. Yeah, you're hurting? Well, you know what? Your loss. Should have not used a fake $20 bill, eh? But the thing is that this is real. This literally happened to this guy. And at the 6-minute mark, he becomes unresponsive. Not moving, he's limp. And then an ambulance is called to the scene. George Floyd is taken away and he later dies in hospital due to asphyxiation by the hands of law enforcement. After the death of George Floyd, the video of the whole incident was released on the internet and people from all over the world reacted to it and they literally witnessed a murder. People were just completely outraged. You have to also take into account that this was months into lockdown measures that had affected everybody. People didn't have work, people couldn't live a normal life. But also from another side, there had been incidents building and building and building up to this. You had Ahmaud Arbery, who was killed by a set of vigilantes just because he was running in an area that made him look suspicious. And you can even go further back. Philando Castile was killed during a traffic stop because he told an officer that he had a registered weapon in the car. But as soon as he was going to get his documents out, he was shot by the officer because the officer panicked and thought that he was going to get assaulted or shot by Philando. And all of these cases and the timing of everything that was going on around just co-aligned, and the outrage could be felt everywhere. With everything combined together, subsequent protests ensued. Now, they started in Minneapolis where the incident took place, but they quickly spread to over 2,000 towns and cities across the United States. And with the mass following of these developments around the world, they quickly came overseas as well. So whether you're from Atlanta, Georgia, or Tbilisi, Georgia, Birmingham, England, or Birmingham, Alabama, millions of people came out to protest against this injustice. There was controversy about the protests. There were people who argued against the use of violence of any kind, and many people in the media actually just categorized the George Floyd protests as violent riots and just, you know, hooligans finding an opportunity to loot. It's not to say that looting is right or that looting did not occur, because it clearly did. However, the issue is with what is expected of people when something of this nature occurs. For decades and decades, peaceful activists had been trying to fight for racial equality and trying to fight against systems of oppression. Yet at every single turn, they were ignored and they were completely delegitimized by authorities, by politicians, and things got worse for black communities. So they took their stance and they decided to make their voices known. And it did get people's attention, and it's undoubtable. But it's not a good full picture of the marches. You see, the majority were completely peaceful. There wasn't violence, there was cooperation, people didn't start fighting one another. And there was also controversy about the police's involvement, that the police were actually instigating a lot of these incidents and attacks. And there's even evidence to suggest that the police actually hired informants to go into the protests and to cause disruption. So it's not as black and white when it comes to how it actually came around. Many black celebrities expressed their sorrow and anger towards what was happening in the States. So many of them were able to use their platform in proactive ways. For example, Floyd Mayweather offered to pay for the actual funeral. And these acts of kindness are not actually foreign to him. He's done these things in the past. Stormzy donated £10 million to organisations fighting against racial inequality. There were also people who came out and they protested and they let their presence be known. John Boyega and Anthony Joshua gave impassioned speeches at their protests. And even Batman came out and stopped fighting the Joker to fight the real joke of racial injustice.
Oh God, I hate to say it, mate, but God, Batman's a black.
Oh, what do you mean? His name's the Dark Knight.
I see your point, but he's just some white guy called Bruce. Oh no! Don't look out there. It's not that Bruce.
The role of corporations in this movement has been highly contested. Having the support of a massive organisation towards your message and towards your movement is overwhelmingly positive, because it gives validation to what you're saying. At the end of the day, if a company big enough is willing to stand out and say that there is a problem, a lot of people will listen. A lot of people did listen, with the thousands, the hundreds of thousands of people, possibly millions, who protested around the world. On the other side, the main criticism is their motivation towards supporting the movement in the first place. Most of these companies come off as a bit hypocritical in their stance to racism, because many of them, in fact the majority of them don't have black CEOs or other executive positions that are held by black people across the world. Some of these companies also have their own human rights problems. Regardless of the motivation of these companies, another problem with the influx of corporate investment into the movement is that the message itself becomes diluted. The point of the movement is not to come off as clean and presentable. It's a tough issue, and there's no clear answer on how to solve this problem. Corporations seem to come along and make an initiative and create an advert. They present it off as the way to deal with racism or sexism or homophobia. But it's a lot more complex than that. So solutions to police brutality and reforms to the police in general vary. There are people who believe in defunding the police, which isn't an abolishment of their service in society, but rather a deconstruction of their responsibilities. They would rather reallocate funds that the police have into other services that need them. Things like social care, for example. Now, this has been a pretty divisive term because people didn't necessarily understand the pretext to it, but it has its supporters and it has its naysayers. There are also people who believe that defunding the police might make the situation worse, because really the issue is the lack of training that a lot of officers have. And is it arguable to say that maybe they would need more funding so they can gain more training? That's just one example of the debate that ensues about how the police should be addressed. If this case has shown anything, it's that police brutality is not a solely racial issue. You see, it's a democratic issue as well, because the police are supposed to be the guardians that protect people. If you have a robber in your house, you call the police. If you see some shady doings in your local neighborhood, where's Spider-Man at? Oh, I guess I'm gonna have to call the police. There are problems with how things are ran in the police force. The fact that it'll be harder for me to become a barber in the United States than become a police officer is astounding. Addressing police brutality is only scratching the surface of the problem of institutional racism in the Western world. There are many things that also need to be addressed, whether that's representation in the media, the education system, or employment opportunities, just to name a few. Yet there is still some hope here. The fact that it's even being addressed in the first place is a good place to start. If young black people can feel like through these protests that they have a voice and that they can express themselves and have hope that things will get better one day, and that should be what the message of these protests provide. The police officers involved in George Floyd's death are all on trial as we speak, and clearly they're not police officers anymore. So if it showed anything, the protest definitely pressured authorities to make a decision on the positions of such individuals. We want to leave you with a little food for thought. America is the land of the free and the home of the brave. Yet despite 2020 challenging the freedoms and exposing the fault lines of American beliefs, the Yanks and their global neighbors showed their bravery for striving towards an American dream where all men are created equal and are treated with respect. Hopefully, the troubles of today can provoke the necessary conversation of tomorrow. And in due time, America may construct the society it dreamt of all them years ago. We hope you enjoyed today's video, and we'll see you at the next worst year.